The polls just closed in Iowa. We are covering the results live tonight there and in Mississippi, including whether the Tea Party is going to make its first primary win in the Senate. But first, we're going to look at the new right-wing playbook for the newly released American POW, a wounded man who isn't even out of the hospital yet. Swift vote first, ask questions later.
Days after the decision to swap 5 former Taliban commanders for America's only prisoner of war.
It's a great day for America, and I could not be angrier about it.
The questions and the controversy are growing.
Growing anger directed at Bergdahl.
Was Bergdahl a hero or a deserter?
What they did not expect was the blowback on Bergdahl himself.
The Army launches a full-scale inquiry to find out.
How much of this do you think is politics, and how much of this is going to be a legitimate inquiry to what actually went on?
Do you think this will feed into the summer of hearings, those hearings about Benghazi?
Benghazi.
Those hearings about Lois Lerner?
6 or 7 on the IRS.
These days, the Republicans will criticize President Obama for whatever he does.
Was Bergdahl a hero or a deserter?
Let's at least give Sergeant Bergdahl a chance to tell his side of the story.
He just walked off the base willingly. Would you then oppose an operation or a swap to get him back?
It puts a whole different light on it.
Despite that, President Obama is standing by his decision regardless of the circumstances, whatever those circumstances may turn out to be.
One military law expert who say what everybody has to do right now is cool down a little bit.
We still get an American soldier back if he's held in captivity, period. Full stop.
A good evening to you. I am Ari Melber in for Lawrence O'Donnell. There is a lot we still don't know about the prisoner transfer that returned former American POW Bo Bergdahl to U.S. custody. Whether he was lost or was he a deserter, for example, or whether this trade could lead to larger negotiations with the Taliban. What we do know is that Bergdahl, a former POW who's under treatment now at a military hospital, is being swift-voted by the reflexive anti-Obama machine. And we know that whatever process he may ultimately face, whatever judgment he might ultimately be issued even in a military court, we know that right now he does deserve better than this. Last night, Bill O'Reilly said Bergdahl's father looked Muslim. Today, Fox built on that theme.
I mean, he says he was growing his beard because his son was in captivity. Well, your son's out now. Right. So if you really no longer want to look like a member of the Taliban, you don't have to look like a member of the Taliban. Are you out of razors?
Meanwhile, the New York Times reported on a very unusual Republican project. A former aide to Mitt Romney is now organizing a PR push for Bergdahl's former platoon members. Take a look at this pretty unusual line from today's paper that we were seeing. Quote, "Yes, I'm angry," Joshua Cornelison, a former medic in Sergeant Bergdahl's platoon, said in an interview, and this is the important part, in an interview arranged by Republican strategists. What exactly are Republican strategists doing in the middle of that reporting? The Times then also went on to quote another former platoon mate of Bergdahl who offered a seemingly minor social detail, saying, quote, he wouldn't drink beer or eat barbecue and hang out with the other 20-year-olds, said in an interview also arranged by Republican strategists. Those soldiers, of course, have every right to their views, but many of their new political allies have little interest here in the facts or the history around Bergdahl. This swift voting is hunting much bigger game.
We have a federal statute which makes it a felony to provide material assistance to a terrorist organization, including human assets. So I have argued that by letting these people free, and the natural and probable results of them being let free is that they will rejoin this terrorist organization. The president has done what his Justice Department has prosecuted people for, successfully prosecuted people for, providing material assistance to a terrorist organization.
You don't have to listen very closely there to hear why conservatives are so downright excited about all this. This is not a debate for them about policy, about whether this was the right trade, which would be, of course, a fair debate. It is now a debate about working against America and a pretty conspiratorial link between some of the worst accusations against this former POW, which are currently totally unproven, and rhetorical questions about this particular president's commitment to our national security.
The release of the 5 Taliban war criminals sets a troubling precedent and is almost indefensible in the face of Sergeant Bergdahl's status. Mr. Obama is going to do what he wants to do, and the consequences be damned. I believe that assessment is accurate. Just think about it. Why would you swap one alleged deserter, because surely President Obama knows the guy left his unit voluntarily, for five notorious war criminals? Why would anyone do that? It simply doesn't make sense, because these Taliban guys will go back to killing people.
Why would anybody do that, Bill O'Reilly wants to know. Why ever release any fighter who targeted Americans? That could sound like a damning question to people who have no familiarity with our history whatsoever. But countries, of course, make tough calls about exchanging POWs all the time, and they do so often at the end of many conflicts that involve living with our former enemies, not vanquishing every last one of them. Even Fox News viewers were reminded of that basic historical fact when a former National Security Counsel from the Bush administration was asked about this transfer deal.
I do think this is a defensible deal. This is not an easy decision, and in the national security world, often for government, you are caught between hard choices like this. So certainly this deal can be criticized. But sometime in the next couple of years, perhaps as early as 2015, we would be required to return these Taliban anyway. The war in Afghanistan is winding down, and we would be required at the end of the conflict to return them. It seems reasonable in this case to get our Sergeant Bergdahl back, not to leave him on the battlefield, to return people who we were going to have to return sooner or later anyway.
Bellinger there served as President Bush's senior associate counsel. He also advised the National Security Council. There are, of course, serious questions to ask about Bo Bergdahl, his record, and whether this transfer was worth the risk, a risk that exists, a risk that we have to measure. But it is telling that so many of the loudest voices here on the right today remain utterly uninterested in any of those questions and are instead obsessed with hurling any accusation that might, just might, stick to this particular president. Joining me now is Karen Finney, host of MSNBC's Disrupt with Karen Finney, and Steve Clemens, Washington editor-at-large for Atlantic Magazine and, of course, an MSNBC contributor. Good evening to you both. Steve, is John Bellinger right?
Absolutely. John Bellinger, who is Condoleezza Rice's lawyer and was George W. Bush's senior lawyer on the National Security Council, made a very good point. We were going to have to give up those soldiers or those Taliban commanders eventually. We got a soldier that had been captured. We got a deal. But I think that what John Bellinger is saying is international law matters, and the further prosecution of these issues matters. And I think one of the things that's been missing is, what are we going to do in Afghanistan? The Taliban is not al-Qaeda. They are a very large incumbent force that we're going to have to deal with even after we leave Afghanistan. And so we need to look at the strategic context of Bergdahl, not just the very narrow sense of one guy for 5 Taliban commanders.
Right, and those 5 Taliban commanders, Karen, come out of a larger number of about 600 people at Guantanamo who have been released. Most have not returned to the battlefield. Some have. That is a risk that is involved every time you deal with detention issues.
Right. That's exactly right. And, but based on what my understanding is, there is a real question as to what these 5 individuals will do. Will they go back into an operational role? Is that a reasonable assumption? And why is it that the same Republicans who are now criticizing the president, 2 things. One, very recently as just a few weeks ago, were urging the administration to do whatever was in their power to free Bo Bergdahl. That's one. And then 2, certainly I didn't hear any of these voices raising concerns during the Bush administration when a number of individuals were freed. And as you pointed out, some did end up going back to the battlefield.
Yeah, and to your point about the history here, and we get it, there are hypocrisies in politics, but this is pretty serious, particularly when you look at the kind of innuendo hurled against a POW who can't even get up and speak to defend himself yet because he is literally being debriefed in a military hospital. And as I've said, if there's any kind of court-martial process, then that will play out. But let's be judicious about that and not begin with the swift boating. Let's begin with the questions. On the diplomatic front, Steve, I want to play some sound, and I want to play it at length because it's illuminating and to be fair, of Senator McCain in February asked about the possibility of this very same transfer swap, the same individuals coming out of Gitmo. Take a listen.
The Taliban has long demanded the release of 5 Taliban prisoners from Guantanamo in exchange for his release. Well, today, a U.S. official confirmed that new discussions led by diplomats and the Pentagon are underway. Would you oppose the idea of some form of negotiations or prisoner exchange? I know back in 2012 you called the idea of even negotiating with the Taliban bizarre, highly questionable.
Well, at that time, the proposal was that they would release Taliban, some of them really hardcore, particularly 5 really hardcore Taliban leaders, as a confidence-building measure. Now this idea is for an exchange of prisoners for our American fighting man. I would be inclined to support such a thing, depending on a lot of the details.
So if there was the possibility of some sort of exchange, that's something you would support?
I would support. Obviously, I'd have to know the details, but I would support ways of bringing him home, and if exchange was one of them, I think that would be something I think we should seriously consider.
Steve, put that in context for us.
Well, John McCain was a prisoner of war. He understands prisoners of war. We have Chuck Hagel, who's Secretary of Defense, who is known as Sergeant Hagel. It is a sacred responsibility to go bring soldiers home that are made prisoners of war, and this war is coming to an end. And I think John McCain was quite sensible at that time. You know, Dennis McDonough, the President's Chief of Staff, said unambiguously yesterday, I was in the room, that he not only knows consultations were held between the White House and the Congress, he did the consultations. And I'm sure that John McCain was part of those consultations around that time, among others. And so I think that what you're seeing is a lot of opportunistic, knee-jerk politicking around Bergdahl in a way to oppose any foreign policy success that President Obama might be achieving here. But the broader issue is, in Qatar, the Taliban have an office. We've been trying to structure a peace deal with them, and this step with Bergdahl is vital to that.
And Karen, as we look at the fallout from all this, at what point do these kind of attacks on this POW, before he's had a potential day in court, if he ever has a day in court,
right,
at what point do you think they may actually backfire on some of these right-wing critics?
I certainly hope sooner rather than later, but I think we are, I think here's one of the things I think that they've done on the right is they've kind of jumbled all of these issues together, and they're sort of using surrogates, if you will, to attack this young man, and sort of attack, which is an American idea, that you are innocent until proven guilty, by the way. It's part of what we're supposed to be fighting for. But, that they have jumbled all of this together so that essentially the focus is on questioning President Obama's decision-making, rather than, we have a number of different issues here, right? And rather than separating them out and taking them piece by piece, they are, I think, as Steve said, being very opportunistic. I have to say, it's really disgusting. It was not even within hours we saw attacks on this young man and on this decision, and there wasn't even a moment of, you would have liked to see a moment of, let's all rejoice as a country that, this young man was freed, and then let's deal with the other issues. But we barely even got that moment.
Right, and the issues are, as we've said, larger than this individual. I really think there's nothing more anti-American here than being anti-American, and to the extent that these attacks are political, the ones coming from the Republicans quoted in the New York Times, and people with their vendettas against this individual, it's totally out of bounds. I distinguish that from some of his former platoon mates who may have their own views and no political axe to grind. We're going to keep on the story, obviously. Karen Finney and Steve Clemens, thank you for your time tonight.
Thanks.
Thank you, Ari.
And next, we're going to turn to our election night coverage. As promised, we have some breaking news on results from Iowa and Mississippi, where Republicans are fending off a Tea Party challenge. The balance of power in the picture in the Senate may get a little clearer tonight. That is straight ahead with Steve Schmidt, former Republican strategist for John McCain, and what the NRA is really afraid of when it comes to restaurants saying no to big guns in their restaurants. The video next up. Also, we're going to look at a video that went viral over the weekend, nearly 6 million hits, on a story of a goat and a donkey separated and lost without each other. They were reunited. What happened next? The last word is your place for the story. Mr. G, the goat, and Jelly Bean the donkey. I have their rescuer here. You don't want to miss that.